Okay, and we're in. Hello, Adam Fitzgerald, and
Sean
I'm Sean
Russell,
Russell.
what's up, pal?
Boy, a lot of news this month, and there's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
I know I've been following your updates for the last 2 weeks. You've done I think it's practically daily updates at this point because the news has been coming through so fast. But before we comment on any of all of this ordeal, I just want to do a health check with you. Are you doing okay? How are you holding up, sir?
Well, because this instance has been hard and fast. I probably would say on average I get about 5 to 6 hours sleep. I'm a very light sleeper as it is, so I've been that way for years. So because I go to the gym every other day, I'm always being updated with something going on in Gaza, and it is hourly. It's always something new right off the bat. So, and I'm like a data processor. I have to know right away what's going on. Just it's the way my forte has been going on with 9/11. So yeah, I would say 5 to 6 hours. Stress, but no, not much stress. I'm just, I think I'm more concerned about what this could lead to. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today. Wider regional war that I allude to in my update videos.
Oh, absolutely. I share your concerns,
Yeah.
and like just for me myself, I have not been sleeping very well ever since I
Oh,
first saw the news about the violence erupting in Israel-Palestine about 2 weeks ago. I first heard the news late at night, for example, and I was like, "Oh no, I'm not sleeping tonight." And I've just barely been getting through it because it's all of our worst fears. And it was only in the last couple of days, really, that I sort of was able to emerge from a sort of mild state of shock. I was in a bit of a daze for at least a week there, and like I, for one, wasn't super active on like the social media platforms. I didn't have much to say because really, what do you say when your worst fears happen besides, look, I've been trying to tell you guys. That's what our whole thing is. And what more can you say besides, I told you so? And so, hey, if you're hanging in there, okay, that's great to hear. I guess I'm as good as I can be in
mm,
all of this. And so, you've got many updates from your channels and your accounts about current events. And I wanted to get together with you today to not exactly discuss current events, but sort of discuss past events to formulate a better, broader, and more informed understanding to interpretate what we have going on like today, so we can sort of better interpret the real meaning and the real breadth of this whole scenario, and not have blinders on and not get locked into really limited viewpoints or any extreme narrow limitations that I'm seeing constantly from all sides. And so, before we really get into this discussion, I guess I want to just sort of extend my sympathies to the victims on all sides, because there's a lot of innocent people suffering greatly as we speak, and they have been for the past several days regarding this most recent eruption of violence in
mm.
Israel-Palestine. And just to have some humanity regarding all of this before I get cold and analytical, because that's where I'm going to go from here. I'm just going to be cold and analytical towards all of this uh, for my health and maybe for yours as well. Um, I have noticed, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. There's been trends that I'm seeing in the social media feed, and I'm seeing it come across my screen, where I'm seeing people on basically both sides of this dispute, this equation. I'm seeing people taking really like hardline and extremist views, and like basically advocating, basically aligning with and appreciating the violence on both sides. I'm seeing it from like basically the pro-Israel side, and I'm even seeing it from like the pro-Hamas side. I wanted to get your thoughts about, have you been seeing anything like this, and what does that feel like when you see people in your social feeds basically advocating for violence and killing?
I think you hit the nail on the head here. It's the reason why I'm doing the update videos. the anti-war right suddenly changed 180 right overnight. You know, we heard the voices on OAN, Newsmax, Fox, war against Ukraine, it's a waste, billions of dollars are at stake here. All of a sudden, Hamas attacks Israel, and it's direct. I mean, their vitriol is quite vicious. I think I'm not surprised by it, but I am a little bit taken aback at how rapidly voices like Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro, Jenna Ellis, and others who have basically been calling for an end to the Ukraine war have basically been overwhelmingly in support of Israel attacking Gaza without mercy. And, you know, I've always likened to Republicans as the dumb criminal, whereas the Democrats are the smart criminal. And smart criminal basically won't tell you. He'll allude to the war, allude to why we're attacking in first place. Conservatives will basically come right out and say, kill them all. And for example, Lindsey Graham actually went on Fox News and said we should just flatten the place. I mean, I'm just like, what, you know, goodness gracious, man. Make your thoughts known. Well, what does that even mean, right? Is he talking about specifically Hamas, or is he talking about Palestinians? Because it leaves open for interpretation there, and that causes me concern. When I started seeing the overwhelming viral media reports about what's going on in Gaza, it was overwhelming in support for Israel. Now, yes, you know, like you said, the victims of these Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, brutal attacks, especially at that rave concert, abhorrent and needs to be eradicated. I called for the eradication of Hamas even years ago. Nevertheless, that doesn't give conservative talking heads the right to basically take it out on all Palestinians. And now it's not even about revenge. It's about, this is a war crime. Right now it's over 4,500 dead Palestinians. Half of them are children. By the way, half of the population in Gaza are children. And this is basically not, you know, they're just flattening entire neighborhoods. Ramal, Khan Yunis, you know, in neighborhoods that look like Dresden at this point. So I started doing updated videos, and I like to think I'm bringing an unbiased perspective, much like with 9/11. You know, I was horrified when I saw the films like Loose Change and all these self-appointed 9/11 leaders talk about 9/11 and fringe conspiracies, no planes and living hijackers. I wanted to create viral media to offset the amount of disinformation. Well, here I want to do updated videos to give a unbiased perspective about what's happening in Israel. Now, like you, I do not have any political affiliation. I don't have any religious identification. And I like to think that what I'm doing is unbiased reporting, and basically want to give a true view about what is happening without any slant. But it's unfortunate, Sean, because you're definitely right. The conservative speakers that were suddenly anti-war disappeared overnight. And now we don't have any voices for anti-war except the Libertarian Institute led by Scott Orton and Kyle Anzalone and Conor McFreeman and Patrick McFarlane and Will Porter. You know, those people, they're trying their best. But boy, the war beat keeps drumming on, and they're very loud.
So the news this month is tremendous, and there's so much to say about the current events. But I know that you in particular, you've done a lot of video series, even written work, a lot of video series regarding basically the road to 9/11. That's your primary subject, mine as well. In trying to understand the historical path that led to something like 9/11 2001 in New York and DC. You've got the video series of the same title with your co-host of the Darkened Hour, Richard Cox, and you've also done sort of other iterations of this discussion with such as the 9/11 deep dive with Tommy Salmons of Year Zero, the 9/11 Truth for Grown-Up series with Ryan Dawson, and others that I can't think of off the top of my head. But all of that has to do with just talking about a contentious event like 9/11 and understanding the history which leads up to it. And so what I'm seeing this month is the violence in Israel and Gaza. This violence is already being referred to as Israel's 9/11. So if if today what we're trying to understand is Israel's 9/11, like the 9/11 in New York and DC in 2001, we have to understand the history which led up to it. And interesting enough, comparing these two things that we refer to now as 9/11, Israel's 9/11 exists as a thread of history which is parallel with the 9/11 in 2001 in America. These are things that their histories are side by side, going back in time and at times even intertwining. This is another separate but comparable thread through history, the road to Israel's 9/11. Though what you often do in your discussions is you basically pick a point in history to move forward from, and often you choose the pivotal year of 1979, which is a monumentous year in Middle East history, to walk forward towards 9/11, because in 1979 you have so many key events that basically lay a foundation for the story that you're going to explain, which is 9/11. You have the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Grand Mosque seizure in Mecca, and indeed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But for the story of Israel's 9/11, the news this month, the story of this 9/11 actually goes back further. And so that's why, to even begin to have an informed discussion about what we're talking about this month, we've got to go back even further. And what we're really talking about is Israel-Palestine. Well, you have to understand why there is an Israel-Palestine in the first place. And so that's why, even when I discuss 9/11, I tend to go back and do a real deep dive on it. I start at the Ottoman Empire with 9/11, but we have to do that with this discussion about Israel's 9/11, because it has to do with the formation of the, as we've come to understand it, the modern political Zionist movement, which basically begins at the late 19th century. Zionism, as we've come to understand it, or as it's come to be known, basically created by Theodor Herzl in the late 19th century. And that has to do with the world Jewish diaspora returning to the biblical Holy Land in the Levant, which today is basically Israel. And this is a time in history which is very different from beginning a story, say, in the Cold War, because it's not modern Russia that exists at that time. It's not even Soviet Russia that exists at that time. It's the Russian Empire. There's other European empires at this beginning of this story, like the French and the British, and also indeed the Ottoman Empire, which at the time had hold over the lands of the Middle East. Before the modern Middle East as we know it, before states like Iraq and Syria exist, it's the Ottoman Empire. And the beginnings of this story has to do with the great imperial powers outside of the Ottomans being like key players like the British and the French, who, even before the world wars, even before the collapse, the eventual collapse of the Ottoman Empire, one of the last great empires to collapse, the players in the European imperial powers already had their sights set on the lands of the Middle East with some intent. And we can see that in the historical record regarding the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was the coordination between the British and the French imperialists, namely Mark Sykes on the British side and Francois Georges Picot on the French side, about their plans for what they could do with the territories in the Middle East when the Ottomans are taken out of the picture. And so their ideas would actually come to fruition, because soon after this, you have the First World War. The Ottomans ally with Germany. They lose the war. The Ottomans lose hold of the Middle East, and it's basically swooped up by the victors of that war, people like the French and like the British, who already have intention about what they're going to do with these territories. And they've got a map drawn up. You can see how they've already got an idea about how they're going to partition out this territory. They've got, curiously, look, I have to presume that they tried to make the new Middle East like respected or appreciative towards the native populations, But when I look at this map, it's just got like these great big straight lines all over it. It's like God doesn't make straight lines. You know, like this is a very man-made and arguably flawed or one-sided interpretation of how they're going to draw up these borders. I think it's really possibly with some disrespect or at least a lack of appreciation for the native populations. But they've already got this idea and they begin to implement it, because when the French and the British are now taking control of these territories and they're creating these new territories, like the British create a thing that becomes what we know as Iraq, or they create what we know as Palestine, these territories. The French, they have Syria and they have Lebanon, and they're creating these modern Arab states. It's at the same time as we already have been seeing the return, the aliyah, the return of the world diaspora Jews. They're already going into the Middle East even before this is happening. So for 100 years before this, we've already got basically Jews from around the world, in particular Europe, but from around the world settling in places like Ottoman Syria, and they're establishing like the new Yishuv, the new settlements. And out of necessity, they are creating their autonomous, their ethno political bodies to self-govern, and indeed out of necessity even forming militia groups for protection, because there's the hostile natives in these areas, and the basically Zionist settlers are already like forming their political and militant bodies. Well, with the defeat of the Ottomans, which has to do also with like the enemy of the enemy discussion with the British in the famous story of Lawrence of Arabia, an award-winning film. You learn about T.E. Lawrence, the British military man who basically utilized the proxy forces from Arabia, basically Bedouin tribesmen, Arabs, to fight off the Ottoman Turks in what was understood, at least on the Arab side, as an Arab war for independence. There's many Arabs in the Middle East, but the Ottoman Empire was ruled by Turks, so they're all Muslims, but there's different ethnic castes, and the Arabs were not on top. The Arabs largely didn't rule their own states; they were more subservient to the Turkic Empire, and so there's only like one province that was actually ruled by Arabs, Hijaz in Arabia. Most of these provinces ruled by the Ottomans, the Arabs didn't have control over. So they're motivated to fight for their independence, basically Arab independence, and that was the deal, basically, between the British imperialists and the Sharif of Mecca when this arrangement came to be. And it all plays out to make it so that now these European powers are the ones in charge of the Middle East, and they set new borders, they create these territories, and they basically instill monarchs, subservient monarchs, to rule these areas. And this is all happening in a very quick time frame, but it very soon begins to drift off into the direction where we've arrived at today is many years coming, but it begins to set its course at this point. And this is the early inclination for the Arabs who thought that they were fighting for independence. They may at this time have begun to get an inkling or an idea that the British were doing some double dealings, or there may have been some betrayal on the part of the British, because it is immediately after this that we have the Balfour Declaration, where Lord Arthur Balfour, in Britain, he's basically a minister and foreign secretary, is coordinating with Lord Walter Rothschild, the leader of the British Jewish community, to create a modern Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And they're going to put it in this territory that was called Palestine. They're going to create a new piece of it that will be a homeland for the world diaspora Jews. to immigrate to, because they had been immigrating to the Middle East all over the place, but this is going to be like a centralization. And this is very pleasing for the political Zionists of the time. And that could be where the Arabs start to feel betrayed, or at least one instance of where the native population is going to become distrusting of these outside powers and the dealings that they're having lording over them. Well, the Zionist immigrants come to Palestine, come to British Palestine, and this is more and more settlers. And these Zionist immigrants, it's just more aliyah, it's more return and consolidated in Palestine. They are experiencing the hostilities of the native populations. It's very comparable to what happened hundreds of years ago in the Americas when the European colonists came to what became the United States, and they experienced a variety of exchanges with the native populations. There's a lot of ups and downs and even violence. Well, this occurs in British Palestine as well, where the local Arabs are attacking the settlers. You know, they have different religions. They have like different ethnicities. Even these settlers look European to the natives. You know, they don't even think that these people are the same as them. So there's a lot of violence being directed towards the settlers, and even on the part of the settlers against the native population. There's skirmishing, there's massacres, there's a lot of fighting and a lot of tension on both sides. And so out of necessity, once again, this goes back to creating groups for protection. The settlers form more and even more advanced militia groups to defend themselves. And one early group, and it's significant historically, is Haganah. It means defense. The Zionist settlers form the group Haganah to protect themselves against any hostilities that they might be experiencing there in British Palestine. And this is a beginning of a trend that we see even today, in that there's a recurring situation with these these political paramilitary groups, that they begin to fraction off from one another. We've seen it in more recent times with like the Islamic State, like with ISIS basically like fracturing off of Al Qaeda because Al Qaeda is not extreme enough for them, and they go in more hardline direction, the more zealous direction. Well, the same thing is happening with these guerrilla groups for the Zionist settlers in Palestine, because when Haganah is not hardline enough for some of the membership, some of the ideologues and personnel split off from Haganah and form other groups. And that's where you have things like Irgun, who split off from Haganah. And Haganah is significant because, like, over the years, Haganah would become very potent, would become very powerful. Over the years, they would be training elite bands within them. They had an elite faction called Palmach, and even eventually, like, Haganah would form what is the core, basically the body of the IDF. Like, Haganah basically becomes the Israeli army after independence. But their offshoots are less reasonable. They're things like Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, who would eventually be a prime minister in Israel. Menachem Begin, who would incidentally go on to found the Likud party, the far right-wing party of modern Israel, would have his more extreme group, Irgun, split off from Haganah. And this is the trend that's beginning now here in the Middle East, and we see it actually continue because it doesn't stop there. When Irgun isn't hardcore enough for some of the personnel, they split off again and they make even more extreme groups, because from Irgun you get Lehi, also called Stirngang. And but by this point, a few degrees removed from like Haganah defense organization, well, a few degrees removed from that is the Stirngang, and they're like a literal gang. Now they're thugs, and they basically behave like what we've come to understand as terrorists today, because they're very violent, very ruthless, and they're hardline Zionists. This is all sort of happening in the time frame that there's other political revolutions happening around the Arab world. I don't have time to go into all of them, but like some that are notable would be like what's happening in neighboring Egypt, because there's like anti-imperialist sentiments brewing up in basically British-controlled Egypt and Sudan and Sinai. Like you have the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt, and indeed there's political strife happening in British Palestine. The Muslim Brotherhood was like another example of these like militant groups, that spring up for their own political interests or identitarian ideals, and they even have like more militant organization that comes out of them. Like you have the what's it called? The Nizam, the special apparatus within the Muslim Brotherhood that are like guerrilla fighters. These militant groups are happening all over the place. Well, in particular in British Palestine, we see a lot of dissent from the settlers, from the native Arab population, and this is all bubbling in this cauldron, which is the lid is being held down by the British. It's under British control, but there's like warring groups now within this territory of British Palestine, and it's at this early point. I guess you could point to 1939 with the British White Paper, which is going to be a solution, a political solution on a British directive to divide this territory further. And you could just look at this as like an early two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine problem. This is like the first two-state solution. The British White Paper of 1939, imposed by the British, says that they're actually going to make this two states. British Palestine is going to become two states, and one state is going to be an Arab state, and one state is going to be a Jewish state. And it's interesting to consider because there's always a lot of finger pointing today about, some people might say, oh, well, the Israelis are not accepting of a two-state solution. Look at their policy. Or did people say, look, the Arabs have been offered a two-state solution multiple times and they've never accepted. And so there's a lot of finger pointing going on. But even in this early instance, it didn't look good to the native Arab population. Remember, they still have fresh in their memory this whole idea, at least to them, this whole idea of like British betrayal. They weren't given their independence. They were given a bunch of British subservient monarchs who are all like bought and paid for, probably not doing their people very good. And now there's this like settler colony appearing in their lands as well. And so the Arabs are definitely distrusting of this whole thing. But on the flip side of it, the other side of it is that the Zionists aren't particularly accepting of this either, because even people who are more moderate in the Zionist settler movement, like David Ben-Gurion, who's not even really a hardline extremist, he's like left of center. He's involved with eventually what would be the formation of the Labor Party in modern Israel. He's not a hardline guy like, say, Menachem Begin, but even Ben-Gurion didn't like the idea of there being these two states. He thought the whole thing should just be a Jewish state. So there's these parties that don't see eye to eye, and there's violent skirmishes the whole time. And what you have is like civil wars that just to this day there's like civil wars going on. The Zionists didn't like what the British were doing. Look, the Arabs didn't like it either, but the Zionists didn't like what the British were carving out for them. And it got to the point that they were so upset with this that they basically declared war on the British. It becomes like guerrilla warfare against the British officers. And this is like the beginning of like what would be eventually the Israeli fight for independence. And the Arabs want their independence. They didn't get it. And the Zionists want their independence, and they're going to fight for it as well. And so that's where, these extreme fractioning of these militant groups really comes into play, because the more zealous and the more hardline factions start waging a campaign of terrorism against the British. It's the only thing you can really call it. It's like the beginning of Middle Eastern terrorism. And it's not jihadis doing it. Incredibly, it's actually Zionists doing it against the British to drive them out because they want to control their land. And, like the Irgun, with Menachem Begin. Like Menachem Begin had a wanted poster. Like the Irgun were basically terrorists, and the Stern Gang as well, and they were separate groups, but they're related and they work in coordination, and they did targeted assassinations, grenadings, machine gunnings, bombings, you name it. It's basically guerrilla warfare, terrorism, even like literal criminal operations, because even to the point of like American infamous, notorious American gangsters such as Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were actually supplying Haganah with weapons support from America during these years, because this is where the Zionist militias are they're fighting for their independence, which only exacerbates things because it leads to a British crackdown. The British are trying to keep the lid on this whole thing, and it's slipping out of their control. And the British officials begin to like arrest like thousands of these militiamen, and they raid the offices of the Jewish Agency, and it's like this big security affair. But it only spirals out of control further because in retaliation, then the militant groups just up the ante, because it leads to what is at the time an unprecedented instance of guerrilla warfare and indeed Middle Eastern terrorism, in that Irgun and Stern Gang bomb the King David Hotel, the location of the British official offices. And disguised as Arabs, interesting enough, they sneak in through the kitchen and dynamite bomb the King David Hotel, kills something like 100 people. And in its day, there was nothing like it. In a way, you could look at it as like Israel's first 9/11. The culmination of all of this basically results in the British just throwing their hands up. It's like they don't know what to do with this anymore. And I haven't seen if there's a particular paper that explains it explicitly, if there was one particular reason that the British begin this new trend of policy, but it just in general appears that they were sick of it because they couldn't control it, and the British leave. They hand British Palestine over to the newly formed United Nations, previously the League of Nations, which was basically instrumental in starting this whole thing up in the first place. And they say, look, okay, we're out. We're not, this is no longer our thing. It's now under international law. There's like this civil war going on that we can't contain, and we're just going to get out. And they do. And this is the point where the Zionist settlers say, okay, this is our state. They say, we got a state. And the UN is gonna try to control it. They say, well, this is the plan. And the UN puts out the partition plan. And they say, okay, well, here's your two states. And they carve up new borders within British Palestine, and formerly British Palestine. And that's the partition plan, which shows that, okay, now this piece of land is going to be the Arab state, and this piece of land is going to be the Jewish state. And unlike Sykes-Picot, this is like a really jagged map. It actually doesn't look like a bunch of straight lines. And in fact, it's really peculiar because the partition plan, if this is another early iteration of a two-state solution, it looks really weird. It's like asking for more and more civil war, the way that they draw up this partition plan, because it looks splotchy. It's like one state is like this splotchy snake inside of the other state, and it's like they're wrapped around each other. It's just asking for trouble. And none of these are acceptable to any parties. But what only happens out of this is the civil war erupts into like a literal war for Palestine, because the Zionists say we are now our Jewish state, and the Palestinians don't like that, and nor do all of the contentious Arab states neighboring them, because it leads to basically an attack by like something like the 5 neighboring states, which are all Arab states, and basically representing the motivations of the Arab League. There's been a variety of iterations of like the Arab republics through history, and this is like a pre-Arab modern Arab nationalist Arab League that attacked the Zionists, and it's the war for Palestine, or it's the same thing as the Israeli war for independence. And this is peculiarly the newly formed CIA, Central Intelligence Agency in America, actually thought that the Jews were going to lose this war. Interesting enough, but they didn't. The potent militant groups such as Haganah, they actually defeat the Arab League and the Palestinian rabble. The Muslim Brotherhood even gets involved, and they're fighting on the part of the Arabs in places like Gaza and the West Bank. And these militant organizations like Haganah, they win. And what the result of it though is, after all the fighting and all the bloodshed, the Zionists basically end up with most of Palestine, and they've expanded well beyond what like was originally going to be like their little section, and they've taken most of it actually at this point, and they've killed, defeated, razed the homes of, destroyed the lands of, and expelled hundreds of thousands of native Palestinians. Many are killed, many flee, and it's the better part of a million. It's hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flee. They escape the land of Palestine, and they go into the neighboring countries, and they form what is basically a diaspora of their own, where they are expelled and they have to scatter about. So this is the Israeli War for Independence. This is when Israel is established, and this is also what the Arabs call Nakba. This is the catastrophe. Nakba means catastrophe. So to the Arabs, this is the grievous and highly offensive result of the Israeli War for Independence. So now the Zionists have their state, and the Palestinian natives are driven off into the surrounding countries. And this is where the story begins. This is where we begin the story, because what only happens after this is a series of Arab-Israeli wars. The fighting gets worse and worse and worse, and it goes on to basically to result in like what we have in like the Cold War era, where more extreme organizations begin to form, and more extreme revenge cycles begin to form. There's multiple Arab-Israeli wars, and like beginning with some of the key points in history, such as like the Suez Crisis in neighboring Egypt, where we see the beginnings of like modern Arab nationalism with figures such as Gamal Abdel Nasser, unifying figures such as Nasser, and the increasingly hardened and zealous attitudes which begin to foment in like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And indeed, the Palestinian diaspora, then out of necessity, they form militias, just like the Zionist settlers form militias for protection. Well, now the expelled Palestinians from the Palestine war, they form militias, and they're motivated by a war for independence as well. They're trying to get back the state that never happened or that they lost. So they're motivated, and they form their own autonomous, ethno-political organization. And one of the major ones is basically what we understood as the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is like an umbrella for all these militia groups that were formed by the expelled Palestinians. Which there's multiple. There's at least a half dozen of these major groups. One that's notable is Fatah, that means victory or conquest. Fatah is basically Yasser Arafat's group, and he's like one of the main guerrilla groups within the PLO. But we again see this ongoing trend of the splintering and the fracturing of these political militant groups, where the membership thinks that things are not hardline enough, or things are not working, or they have distaste with the group, and so that they split off from each other, just like Haganah splits off into Irgun, splits off into Lehi. Well, the same thing is happening with the Palestinian groups. And if Fatah is not good enough, well, the guys from them, they split off, and there's other groups. There's like Black September basically is like a more hardline Fatah, and this trend continues into the Cold War era and into the modern day, and throughout what is basically the golden age of terrorism in like the 1960s and 1970s. And so that's where we actually begin this conversation, Adam. So I know I just hit about 50 different points there, but I wanted to sort of set the stage and give us a little bit of a crash course in like what we're even talking about when we're talking about fighting in Israel-Palestine. And I wanted to get your thoughts about how some of these trends and attitudes, you know, on the parts of the religious organizations and the ethnic identitarianism and the revenge cycle all comes into play. And where could you tell us where can we pick up to tell the story of the road to Israel's 9/11 this month, and how can we walk through it?
Well, actually, I would start with the 6 Day War, and only because the prevalent ideology throughout the Arab world, throughout the late 19th century, early 20th century, was Arab nationalism. And that started under the late 19th century, but more prominently beginning in the 50s and 60s, which saw that Arab nations like Syria and Egypt, Afghanistan, wanted to coexist with Islam as the prevalent religion, in that they wanted to create their own economy, strengthen their own communities, strengthen their own governments, and become a world power, just like Great Britain and the United States were, and Russia. Such leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser, you brought up a name, the former Egyptian president, actually wanted to open up better trade with Russia. Now, you know, there's a long history between Egypt and Russia. One such being that the Egyptian State Security Services, the SSI, the infamous brutal torture methods that they had undertaken on people who are dissents or Islamists, basically created their own terrorists with these groups, but they got their trade through the Russian KGB, the intelligence service there. So with this ideology prevalent in the Arab community, came under fire with the 6 Day War. The 6 Day War basically was considered the third Arab-Israeli war that was fought primarily between Egypt, Syria, and Jordan when they invaded Israel. And what happened was, when hostilities broke out, there was poor relations with the Arab neighbors following the armistice agreements, which was signed at the end of the first Arab-Israeli war. But then the Suez Canal, the problem with the Suez Canal came in, and so these countries invaded Israel. What happened was Israel had won, and they basically took over the West Bank. It's on the border of Jordan and Israel, and created their own military encampment within the Gaza Strip. And this caused a lot of problems. Now, the blowback of all this is that the Arab communities in Egypt and Jordan and Syria, Afghanistan, saw Arab nationalism as a failed ideology. And the Islamists, who were kept in the shadows, so to speak, under the oppression of these dictators like Assad and Nasser. And what happened was the Islamist voice began growing. And with the oil boom happening in Saudi Arabia, which is the epicenter of all Islamism, which is founded on Wahhabism, after the founding of this ideology by Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, who created a pact with Ibn Saud, creating the first Saudi state, which is called the Emirate of Diriyah. Muhammad ibn Saud, who you mentioned about the capture of Hijaz and Najd, from the Ottoman Empire, and the Hashemites, Kharijites, created Saudi Arabia, modern-day Saudi Arabia, with the foundation being that the Saudi princes, the kingdom, under the 7 sons of Ibn Saud, which is called the Sudardi 7, would become the military arm. Well, the religious identity of the country would be the Wahhabis, or the clerics of Saudi Arabia. This conjoining still exists today, even though Mohammed bin Salman would like to think that the country is reformed. And I've heard this all throughout the decades. There's no real reforming it. There's just a less voice. And what this did was, the billions of dollars that were pumped through the oil boom went to the madrasas, all in these countries that didn't have a Islamist problem. And what happened was Arab nationalism collapsed and Islamism began to take place. Groups like Al-Jihad, which was formed in Egypt, which was an Islamist sect, more radical than the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. You talk about how radical groups formed, branch out into far more radical groups. That's what happened in Egypt. But that translated into Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. And soon, all of a sudden, countries like Syria and Libya and Jordan, all these countries started seeing a problem of Islamist groups that were arising out of foreign policy within their own countries, or U.S. foreign policy, or Israeli foreign policy. Israeli foreign policy was detrimental to who? The Palestinians. The Arab countries that surrounding Israel were speaking out against the subjugation of the Palestinians. And so the Islamists were now the voice instead of the Arab nationalists, because the Arab nationalists were seen as the real power and the pressure of a two-state solution. Groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat. Now, of course, this group started terrorist activities, and another branch of it came out, was Fatah, created by Fatah PLO, which was headed by Abu Nidal, who you're very much familiar with.
Fatah Revolutionary Council.
That's correct, right.
A split off from Fatah.
Right, thank you. And that basically, the only reason why they existed was because they saw Yasser Arafat as too liberal or too socialist. But Arafat basically curtailed on the terrorist activities in Israel because he saw as a detriment to its two-state solution, which he wanted. So he went to other countries and went to countries like France and Germany and said, we have a problem here. We want a two-state solution. And other European international theater countries saw this as a detriment to peace in the region and started pressuring Israel about finding a two-state solution. So what did Israel do? Well, Israel basically saw another group that basically would be an assistant to them. So in other words, you bring up the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, there was a group called Al-Jama Islamiyah, and it was created by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was actually a quadriplegic, a Palestinian refugee with connections to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And what they did was the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood started a group called the Al-Mujama Al-Islamiyah. And translated from the English, it's called Islamic Center. And so Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt considers Israel an enemy. Egypt and Israel from the Six-Day War were the enemies. But nevertheless, they sent clerics to Gaza to create this group in universities, situated in hospitals, situated in schools. But the Israeli government knew what was happening and started to see this radical offshoot from Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as a worthwhile asset. And why did they do that? Because they considered the PLO the greater enemy, because what they didn't want was a two-state solution. So the Israeli government used the Al-Mujama Islamiyah and told the Shin Bet Domestic Intelligence Service and the local police not to interfere with the growth of this group. That's not me saying it, it's from the public record. But there was another incident that created what would be now known as Hamas. And I don't know the year, it happened in the late 1980s, was that there was an incident where there was an Israeli army truck that crashed into a military Gaza checkpoint and killed somewhere between 5 to 10 Palestinian day workers. And it was on purpose. Members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood from the Al-Mujahideen Islamiyah went to Sheikh Yassin's house and said, we need to react. We need to, fight back because they're not arresting these people. The Israeli government are not charging these military members for doing this. And Sheikh Yassin thought about it and said, no, that's exactly what they want. They want us to react. So what we'll do is we'll engage in resistance. So what they did was the next couple of days, they gathered up Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, in neighboring counties, in neighboring cities, and created a huge resistance protest about this incident. And what they did was from here was that they created a group called Hamas, modern day Hamas. And from here, Hamas, which was given the license or the allowance to grow, knowing full well that they are basically just coming out of this al-Mujahideen Islamiyah group, and which basically was from the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And later on, Hamas would become the primary adversary to the PLO because they saw the PLO as a socialist group, as and Islamism and socialism were still at odds and enemies. There was conflicts in Jordan over this. One such notable Palestinian Islamic cleric, Abdul Yusuf Yazam, who is considered the father of modern day jihad, saw the enemy of communism and socialism in Arab countries as the offshoots of Arab nationalism. And so Islamism was at war with it, the remnants of Arab nationalism. And so Israel saw this as, hey, we can use this Hamas group to basically fight off against the PLO. And they were successful because the PLO basically was engaging in a battle with Hamas and basically, by extension, the Israeli government, because the Israeli government was backing Hamas against the PLO. One such Israeli general, IDF general, I forgot his name, forgive me, basically came out and said that we created the Frankenstein monster and we regret it because we saw as the greater enemy at the time the PLO. But I think they actually knew what they were doing, was that the PLO was the greater enemy because the two-state solution was the enemy. It was the enemy to the Israeli Zionist government. It was the enemy to the Israeli people, even though the people basically didn't care because for decades and centuries before that, Palestinians and Jews lived together in Israel, in Palestine, for millennia without a problem. There was no Islamism problem. There was no Zionist problem. It didn't start until 1948, which is so eloquently elucidated here in your presentation. And this is the reason why I think it's key, like with 9/11, and you're right in this regard, how do we understand what is going on today if we don't go back to a certain point in time? And it really all depends on that certain point in time. Furthermore you go back, the more you understand. But if you don't go back to a point in time, you're not going to understand the present because the past dictates what is going on in the present. And the person that taught me that, he didn't teach me directly, was I consider the best 9/11 researcher on the planet, Paul Thompson. And he wrote the book, The Terror Timeline. And he went back in time to explain about 9/11. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. And that's how I looked at history. Not just 9/11, but I look at history. And you are right. You're absolutely correct, Sean. If you want to learn about the context of what's happening today, we have to go back and explain it about what is the foundation of Zionism, what is Islamism, what are Hamas, what is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who is Benjamin Netanyahu, why are the Palestinians militant groups fighting against the Israeli government, why is the Israeli government pushing out the Palestinians, what's going on here? Well, if you're just going to go by the last 7 days, that's not going to tell you anything. So I agree with you about going back at a certain point in time and explaining what is happening currently, and I hope I didn't lose everybody there.
So it's easy enough because hindsight is 2020. It's easy enough to look back. We can read the histories. It's all public record. I don't want to try to predict the future, and in fact, if I was to speculate on the future, I would really make myself even more depressed than I already am.
Oh.
So in not trying to predict the future, I'm wondering, could you speculate mildly within reason? What's your reasoned speculation on this item? We compare things to 9/11, predominantly 9/11 researchers, and there's a component related to the Israelis with the story of 9/11, and that's that Benjamin Netanyahu had made the comment after America's 9/11 that it was good for Israel, basically because it means that the Americans are going to sympathize with the Israelis regarding their most common modern threat, their most horrendous threat, which is terrorism. Going to sympathize with the Israelis fighting against their terrorist enemies. Netanyahu said that 9/11 was good for Israel. So, in very reasoned speculation, do you think that today, now I don't think he would ever say it, but do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu today would have a similar thought regarding Israel's 9/11 this month?
I would say it serves twofold, and it goes from my perspective, it's twofold. One is the elimination of a two-state solution, and also the elimination of Hamas. And let me explain. When Benjamin Netanyahu won the sixth run as prime minister in December of 2022, he immediately created a cabinet. And if you look at Netanyahu's entire political career, he's Likud oriented. They're an ultra nationalist party. The majority party right now in the Knesset, which is the U.S. version of the Congress. The Labor Party, or the Blue and White Party, which is headed by oh geez, now I'm forgetting the president. He just formed the war coalition. Excuse me, I forgot the Israeli president's name. But he's head of the Blue and White Party, which is the more liberal party. But what happens is when he made this cabinet, he made it not just with Zionists, but also Israeli settler leaders as well. One such individual is Ben Gvir. Ben Gvir, who I consider a vampire. Ben Gvir has a notorious history, Israeli settler, who's the national security cabinet leader, basically has come out in the open saying that he approves of Palestinian murders, Israeli Palestinian murders of children, in which he celebrated. I think he went to actually a Palestinian neighborhood with a gun in his hand, waving it around at Palestinians, daring him to come at him. And he's a cabinet member. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant basically has called for the open warfare of Palestinians and called for the expulsions of Palestinians in the largest, most densest population in Gaza City, which right now is surrounded by 430,000 reservists in the Israeli military, just waiting to enter and expulse all the Palestinians. They gave them 24 hours to leave, and right now they're flattening the areas surrounding it. This is what makes the cabinet, and they don't hide their wishes, unlike the previous governments. And that's saying something, because when you look at the government's prime minister, like Ariel Sharon, for example, who is a war criminal just by the definitions of the international criminal courts, or Ehud Barak, for example, who basically used the 9/11 attacks as a springboard to basically attack Palestinians, which they did on the evening of September 11, 2001, incidentally enough. This government should give you pause, should give you hesitation and worry about where the future of the Palestinian state. And if you go by, and that's why I did an update video about the cabinet of Netanyahu's cabinet, because I want people to see what the future of the Israeli government holds. And if this war cabinet stays put, and I don't see it in a dissolution any meaning, I see these conflicts. I mean, I'm a pessimist, don't take me, for example, but I see a worrisome future in Israel in that I see a very radical government. Now, at the same time, we have the Hamas problem. And I think they're going to liquidate the entire hierarchy, not the ones in Qatar. They're the ones who are rich, and they took their money and their funding and their donations and left the Palestinians behind, because they never cared about Palestinians to begin with. And I called for the elimination of Hamas years ago. You want to get rid of the problem, get rid of Hamas, get rid of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It'd be a lot more problems, say, for example, Sean, if you were to get rid of al-Qaeda, say, in the Arabian Peninsula or in the United States in the 1990s. It would have been hard, because we don't know. The country is much bigger. The Arabian Peninsula is much bigger. With Israel, it's much more condensed. much more fractured, much more compartmentalized. We know where Hamas resides in Gaza. You have Israeli spies, Mr. Avrim, which is a very covert unit, which basically trains Israeli Arabs, Israelis, to live, to sound like, to look like Arabs in these areas, to spy on where Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are in the West Bank, are in Gaza Strip. Then you have Palestinians who will form on Hamas for basic necessities that they don't have, like, say, extra goods or a work pass to basically get out of Gaza and work outside of it. And it won't be impeded with the Israeli military if they spy on the Palestinians and where Hamas is. So you have all the, and this is why I'm shocked that Hamas broke right through the fence and just attacked Israel unimpeded and didn't respond for 6 hours. That's another conspiracy in its own right. Nevertheless, that sounds like 9/11, doesn't it? Intelligence failures that led to a terrorist attack. Meanwhile, we did have the intelligence that they were there inside the United States, Al-Qaeda, and that they were going to hijack planes. That's the conspiracy. Well, maybe in the future we'll know that the Israeli intelligence services like Shin Bet got intelligence. Oh, wait a minute. Egyptian intelligence basically warned of a Hamas attack days prior to the attacks. And no, Israeli military didn't, or the Israeli government didn't take the necessary steps to enforce stricter security measures. I think that's a whole conspiracy itself, not to delve into the fringe mindsets, right? But I think with Netanyahu, I think it's basically a two-solution step here from this forward out. And I don't think it's a conspiracy at all. It's the elimination of Hamas and the expulsion of the Palestinians in Gaza City. In the future, now, what do these 1 million refugees do? Well, they'll go to the Rafah border of Egypt. They can't go north of the Egyptian, the Lebanon-Israeli border, because right now, Lebanese militia groups and the Israeli government are conducting attacks on the border there. So, and the Israeli military won't allow Palestinians to go north because they don't want them in the West Bank. They want them out. And what this means in the future is that once they're out of Gaza City will not be under the Israeli military control, but it won't be inhabited by Palestinians at all. And that's the whole point, is that this is a land grab to slowly push out Palestinians. And in the future, what will happen is these refugees, either they'll be killed in air raids in the future when they continue saying, oh, this is Hamas-oriented, They can always use it as an excuse because they can get away with it, because Israel, like the United States, are not co-signers of the international Rome statutes, which is another reason why I made that video about outlining what the Rome statutes are: war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, and genocide. Israel is not co-signing the Rome statutes. They can get away with stuff like this. That's why the United States can get away with stuff like this. So in essence, Sean, I think I don't think it's too bold and too conspiratorial to think that the Netanyahu government sees this as a 9/11 symptom, in that it's solving two problems. One, the elimination of Hamas, and two, which is the worrisome trend, is that the expulsion of Palestinians out of Israel itself. But right now, at least out of Gaza City. And I think this will lead to a problem in the future, the total expulsion of Palestinians out of Israel. I think all right, if you want to say it's a stretch, sure, but it's not out of the realms of possibility, because would we ever think that we would have 1.1 million Palestinians out of Gaza City? No. A couple of days ago, we would have said you were nuts. But that's what's happening. And it's being allowed because the United States and their coalition partners won't do a damn thing, because they're all Israeli affiliated through the Israeli Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, or through their own donors, or through Israeli intelligence. Maybe they have blackmail on these leaders. Not too conspiratorial to talk about that, because that leads to the Epstein case and whatnot. We won't go there. But I think that's what's happening in the future. I hope I'm wrong, but I think what's going to happen, Sean, in the future is that this is going to reach out to a wider regional war that involves Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. And they can't take in refugees if they're at war. So where do these people go? Do they go to Egypt? Do they go to the Gulf? Where do they go? or are they killed where they stand? I don't think it matters to the Israeli government.
I hope I'm wrong every day. I hope, in a more positive note, I hope that the people of Israel and Palestine form their own truth movement and they start researching the history of Israel's 9/11 and start to put together pieces over there in the Levant and form their own truth movement. I think that would be just honky dory. Well, I don't know the future, but I think that you're very reasonably speculating about some very possible outcomes. And I'll be following your updates, Adam, and other people who are reporting on this as well, because uh, as the news continues to come in, some of our worst fears are being confirmed, and it's very exciting times.
Yeah, I think what if we can end it on, I wish there would be more voices out. Look, I was shy, just like some people out there. I didn't like my face. I don't like my voice. But I think we need more active voices talking about issues like this because it involves all of us as a humanity, and we want a better world. And for those who have children like you, Sean, we want a better world for our future of our children. I mean, it's just what a parent would want. I mean, if we can't take advantage of this situation and force these governments to basically acquiesce to a better, more peaceful solution, then what are we living for, right? Are we living for, just to complain and do nothing? So, write an article or, do a short video. You don't have to do a 2-hour video like we're doing here. I mean, we're quite invested and we have a lot of years behind in terms of study. But if you're just starting out, hey, your voice counts just like ours. And we basically are representative of you, the people. And so I would love to see more people speak out about this subject of what's going on in Israel. And of course, with 9/11, but with just current events, yeah, make your voice heard because it's important.
Well, this has been a fabulous discussion, Adam. I appreciate your time, and I think we covered a lot of great stuff. We left a ton out.
Yeah.
You just can't cover everything. This stuff fills books and very long films, and we're just rattling this off the cuff. But I hope this has given some people some informative items to look into on their own, and hopefully form a better and broader, better informed understanding about the current events, which are they're very important, and the implications about the future for not just the region in the Middle East, but even for humanity. This all matters greatly, and I hope that everyone is doing what they can. I'd like to see more action as well.
Sure enough, and thank you very much for having this discussion with me. It's very important too. So thank you.
No, you're welcome. It's been my pleasure.